In section 2.1, we're talking about evaluating expressions. First, expressions are things without equal signs. Evaluating is being given a value for a variable or an unknown. The thing to think about for a variable is that it's a number that we don't know the value of. When we're solving, which we'll talk about soon, we're trying to find the value for the variable that makes the equation true. In an expression, when we're evaluating, we're trying to figure out the value of the expression given a certain number, okay, that we've actually been given. So the process for evaluating is, first of all, and this is one of these strategies that makes all the difference. If you do it, you tend to get the problems right. If you choose not to do it, there's a very high probability of getting things wrong. The reason is that by doing it the way I'm going to show you, it incorporates your signs, your negatives and positives correctly. And so you don't end up misapplying negatives in particular. Okay, so step 1 is to replace each variable with parentheses. Step 2 is inserting the value of the variable into those parentheses. And when you're evaluating, you will have been given those values that you'll plug in. And then you'll fully simplify, which is just combine things as much as you can. Okay, so again, the purpose of evaluating is finding the value of an expression when you're given the value of unknowns shown as variables. Okay, so for number 1 here, we have evaluate when x equals -2. So remember, the first step is to replace each variable with parentheses. So what I mean by that is I'm going to rewrite x minus 5. I'm taking the x out and I'm putting parentheses in, and then I'm subtracting my 5. So I'm just finishing out what I had written here. Now I insert the value of the variable, which has been given as -2, into the parenthesis, and now I simplify. Well, this is 2 negatives, right? So that means my answer has to be negative. I'm starting at -2. I'm going to the left 5, so my final answer is -7. Okay, so here's the next one. Here we have 5 minus x. All right, so step 1 is to rewrite this by taking the variable out and replacing it with parentheses. So I get 5 minus parentheses. Step 2 is to now put the value that we've been given into the parentheses, which is a -2. Now notice, this is a perfect example of why we want to use these parentheses, because if we didn't, it would be much more difficult to see the double negative that we have here. And remember, when you have a double negative, it turns positive. So in this case, I'm just going to mark that as positive. That's what I do shorthand to show that those 2 negatives turn positive. There are multiple ways of doing it, but that's what I've chosen to do over the years. Okay, and then that simplifies to +7. All right, so now for the next one, I have x squared plus 2. So again, I take out my variable and I replace it with a parenthesis. And it's an x squared, so now I need parentheses squared plus 2. All right, now I put my -2 into the parentheses, and then I simplify. So here I need to follow order of operations, right? So order of operations says, and I'm going to write my PEMDAS here. I always recommend whenever you're simplifying or solving, write PEMDAS down and then use it as a map. So what I mean by that is G is for grouping, right? And in this case, I don't actually have grouping, even though it's parentheses. It's more indicating that that exponent is being applied to the -2. There's nothing to combine within it, okay, within those parentheses. So we don't have grouping, but we do have exponents. So I'm going to go over to my exponent. And remember, the negative is part of the base because of the parentheses. So I'm going to expand that as -2 times -2. which becomes 4. And then I add my 2. So that simplifies to 6. So that is my final answer. I'll go ahead and put a box around that one too. All right, so now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go ahead and pull the variable out and replace it with parentheses. So I have negative parentheses squared plus 2. Now I substitute the negative 2 in, so negative 2. Now again, order of operations, right? I don't have grouping, but I do have exponents, so I need to apply that. So this, again, is negative 2 times negative 2 right here. So it becomes negative, right? So that's the negative on the outside. Negative 2 squared is positive 4 plus 2. Now, a reminder, this was a note that were in the guided notes earlier, and it talked about anytime you have a negative sitting next to something, it's the same as multiplying by negative 1. So here, really what's happening is you're taking your negative 1 and multiplying it by 4. So you get negative 4 plus 2, which gives you negative 2. And that is your final answer. All right, so now pause the video, try E, and then turn it back on and watch me do the remainder of the problem. All right, so first step. In this case, we actually have more than one x, but that doesn't change our process. That just means that we take this first x and replace it with a parenthesis. And then I write out the rest of the problem and then take this x out and replace it with a parenthesis. And then close out that exterior parenthesis. Okay, so now I substitute my negative 2 in. So negative 2, negative 2. Now, a lot of people have the tendency to just pull the x out, put the parentheses and the number in at the same time. You need to make it 2 steps, right? So I'm taking all the variables out and replacing them with parentheses. That's my first step. Second step is to then go in and put the number in. You may feel like that's a small difference, but it isn't, right? Over the time, when I do it, when I see others do it, not having 2 separate steps increases the chances of making mistakes significantly. So, okay, so now we're dealing once again with order of operations. So this time we do have grouping, right? We have these parentheses. Well, I see a double negative here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn those positive. Now I have negative 2. That's this one right here. I have parentheses. That's for this parenthesis right here. 7 plus 2, which is 9. And now I have 2 parentheses sitting next to each other, which is multiplication. So that gives me negative 18. And that is your final answer. So in summary, remember, I'm going to scroll back up here to your steps, right? So anytime you see steps, which you'll see throughout these notes, make sure that as you're learning something, you follow the steps. So I would say, I would look at number 1, for example, and I would say, okay, replacing each variable with parentheses. I would then go in and do that. Then I would go back and read step 2, insert the value, right? That's step 2. And then step 3, go ahead and fully simplify. So use these as your map, just like we do for order of operations to guide you. So with a map, you look at the map and then you go somewhere, right? Instead of go somewhere and then hope you got there. So again, with a map, you've got to look at it first, each step, right? And follow that as you go. All right, good job.